He found her on the marble steps, a small figure swallowed by the blank grandeur of the house. The staircase was polished to a mirror sheen, every riser reflecting chandeliers in the hush of a home built to impress. On that cold surface she sat in her pajamas, knees tucked to her chest, fingers tracing the edge of a scuff mark as if it were the only thing that could hold her still. Her voice was the size of a whisper. "I'm starving." Those two words cut through the quiet like a siren. Eduardo had created companies that moved markets. He had negotiated contracts at 3 in the morning and met presidents across continents. He had built a life where everything glittered on schedule. But nothing in any boardroom had prepared him for the smallness of that voice, for the way a 6-year-old's admission could rearrange priorities faster than any shareholder meeting. He remembered, always, how he had first held her. She had been a week old when he signed the papers, the doctor's face softened by grief and gratitude. The biological mother had died in childbirth. Eduardo had sat in a sterile room and felt a responsibility that was larger than grief or timing. He had had money, and he had had the impulse to do something irrevocable. So he adopted her. He gave her a name, Sophia. He told himself that when he returned from another deal from another city, the small life in that crib would be waiting, and they would become a family. Now, under the chandelier, she looked like a ghost of that choice. Her cheeks had hollowed just enough that the shadow under her cheekbones read like a fault in marble. Her pajama sleeves were too long, her hair stuck to her forehead in a damp little curl. She did not reach for him when he knelt. She only said, again, with an earnestness that was almost clinical in its despair, "I'm starving." Eduardo put his briefcase down and held out his hands like someone apologizing to a child for being late to a funeral. He went to the kitchen, opened cupboards that smelled of lemon cleaners and bottles aligned like trophies. A plate, his hands shook when he found one, was clean, a cluster of untouched cutlery beside it. The pantry door clicked shut. He tried the handle. It was locked. "Where were you?" he asked, voice small. From the hallway came the sound of heels, measured and distinct. Patricia's footsteps had a rhythm he had learned to associate with cold certainty. 3 precise clicks, a glide on marble, a sound that announced control. She appeared at the top of the stairs as if she had been carved from the house itself. Silk hair, sculpted cheekbones, a smile calibrated for the cameras. Her eyes, when they fell on Sophia, looked like they belonged to someone mouthing a script. "She requires discipline," she said, as if explaining a flavor. "We're watching her intake." Eduardo's hands were still on the heavy ceramic plate. "She said she's starving," he said. Patricia tilted her head slightly, the expression of a woman who expected a pause long enough for her explanation to settle. "Children can be dramatic," she said. "She was fussy. I was correcting. She will be healthier without so many sweets." Sophia's hands scrabbled at the edge of the step, her fingers, small and sticky in a way that betrayed recent crumbs, curled around nothing. She did not look at Patricia. She looked at Eduardo as if he might conjure a miracle. The plate in his hands felt suddenly very heavy. He fed her, then. He mashed bananas with his own hands and coaxed ounces of milk into a mouth that took them like a suspicion. She ate with the fervor of someone rediscovering a lost map. He called his assistant, then called the household manager. He called the pediatrician on call. He did the thing the wealthy thought would mend everything. He put money behind urgency. But hospitals don't accept wealth as a diagnosis. Dr. Renato's office was a room softened by posters of smiling children and sterilized by the scent of antiseptic. He was patient, pragmatic, and blunt. He examined her with gloved hands and a steady, clinical tenderness. He asked questions in lists. When did she last eat? What was her weight history? Any vomiting or persistent diarrhea? Developmental milestones. He charted her answers in shorthand Eduardo suddenly could not parse. "She is underweight," Dr. Renato said finally, tapping the digital scale results. Not a 100-year-old rickets story. This is malnutrition, moderate to severe. We'll run blood panels, check for anemia, electrolyte imbalances, her skin tenting. There's evidence she's been without adequate caloric intake over weeks, maybe months. Months? The word landed like a stone. Eduardo felt the floor move beneath him in a way that no elevator he had ever built could have predicted. Memory slammed into him. Dinners he'd missed, stories he'd promised to read, the small excuses that had been a life. How many late-night conference calls mattered beside a child's empty plate? Dr. Renato continued, I have to inform Child Protective Services. It's mandatory. We are a licensed facility. We have to report suspected neglect. He did not look at Eduardo with accusation. He did not need to. The law sat between them like glass. The hospital social worker arrived in a cardigan and a badge, the human intersection of policy and crisis. The social worker spoke in procedural phrases, assessment, immediate safety, temporary placement, terms that flattened private panic into forms to be filled. We will need to assess the living situation, she said. We'll coordinate a child safety plan. Until then, we may need to place Sophia in an emergency foster placement or a protective care facility. Eduardo's chest narrowed. He, who had fought corporate takeovers, who had negotiated contracts with governments, felt powerless in the face of a packet of forms. He signed with a hand that trembled. He watched Sophia sleep under a thin hospital blanket, breath shallow but regular. He thought of his adoption papers, of the vow he had made to a hollow nursery in another city, and of the way that vow sat suddenly at odds with the law designed to keep children safe. News of the hospital call moved faster than his calls to lawyers. Patricia, adept at contouring her image, called a PR consultant whose number was on speed dial for household crises that risked unveiling more damaging headlines than a scandal at a board meeting. Within 24 hours, a glossy feature appeared online. Unstable home life? Sources suggest tension at tech magnate's residence. The article used anonymous sources and a tone that asked questions without providing answers. It insinuated neglect by omission, highlighting Eduardo's travel schedule and his limited involvement in family time. Patricia circulated a perfectly composed Instagram post, a photo of her kneeling in a field of sunflowers, Sophia laughing beside her, an image edited to convey tranquility. The public room where Patricia performed had always been carefully lit. She knew how to place herself in frames that blurred the edges of complexity. She curated testimonies from neighbors, arranged for a fashion columnist to describe her natural, disciplined parenting, and planted suggestive comments in private parenting forums about the dangers of permissive fathers. There was a network of influence, a PR machine that could turn a complaint into a narrative, and a narrative into evidence of the wrong parent. Eduardo watched it happen like a man watching a company he had built suffer a hostile takeover. He had resources, certainly, but the public mind moves on its own timelines. Comments piled up under the article, some sympathetic, some venomous. A few suggested neglect, others hinted at worse. The company's stock dipped as analysts spun the story into risk. Reporters began to call. A morning show requested an on-camera statement. Stakeholders demanded assurance. Board members sent cautious emails. But the most wrenching thing was not the public clamor. It was the knock on the hospital room door at dawn. 2 social workers and a uniformed officer waited in the corridor, expressions practiced and soft. They had come with a court order for temporary removal. They explained that given the medical findings and reports from several sources, the state would take temporary protective custody of Sophia pending an emergency hearing. The words were procedural, but the consequences were immediate. Sophia would not go home tonight. Eduardo signed papers that allowed the hospital to coordinate placement. Sophia awoke to the sounds of the shoes again. This time, not Patricia's acoustic authority, but the steady, bureaucratic, calibrated tread of caseworkers. She was buttoned into a car seat, small fingers clinging to a threadbare stuffed rabbit she had won at a charity fair months before. Eduardo had to let her go. He kissed her forehead and felt the weight of a custody order like a new kind of debt. He returned to an empty house that smelled faintly of lemon and expensive laundry detergent. On the kitchen counter lay a children's drawing he had not noticed before, a large sun with a small circle beneath it, and next to the circle a crayon plate, the rim drawn thick as if the artist wanted to make it permanent. There was a tiny figure beside the plate and a scribble that could almost be letters. It was the sort of art parents keep in the pantry, a sentimental bank of small things. In that moment, he understood that the drawing was not just a childish gesture, but a clue, a map to a hidden truth. He put it in his pocket like contraband. He wanted answers. He wanted to be able to prove to the world and to himself that he was not the negligent father the headlines were painting. He wanted to prove that the person accusing him was lying. He picked up the phone and called the firm he had used for executive protection. "Get me a lawyer," he said, "and someone to look into the house." The lawyer he called was a woman named Mariana, whose voice was steady in the face of chaos. She walked him through the immediate steps. File for emergency access to the child, given the legal presumption favoring parental bonds when safety could be assured. Demand copies of the hospital records, request a hearing, and, crucially, gather contrary evidence. "We'll need witnesses," she said, "former staff, anyone who can testify to household routines, to your involvement. We need contemporaneous evidence, messages, security footage, anything that dates behavior." Security footage. The house had had cameras for years. Entrances, the kitchen, the driveway. Eduardo had never paid them much attention. They were for his peace of mind when he was on stage or on a plane. He had never imagined those cameras would have to speak for his daughter. When he returned to the mansion that night, he walked the rooms with the deliberateness of someone trying to memorize a landscape he might lose. The cold in the hallway had become a metaphor. The decorative vases looked like monuments to complacency. In the nursery, a mogul still turned slowly, as if waiting for a lullaby that never came. He found notes on the back of the pantry door, inventory lists in Patricia's tidy handwriting, dates beside the words "restrict sweets" and "wean to protein." They read like a regimen written for some experiment, clinical and exact. He called Camila, the housekeeper, who had worked for the family for years. Camila had the low, cracked voice of someone who had seen both the best and worst of a household. She answered on the third ring. Eduardo could almost hear a hesitation in her breath. "She kept track," she said softly. "She liked order, but sometimes plates disappeared, leftovers that were wrapped and then gone the next day. The nanny tried to substitute, but she didn't like to be contradicted." "Did you ever see her take food from Sofia?" Eduardo asked. Silence on the other end stretched. "Once," Camila said, Patricia, took the plate away and told the girl she was fine. I thought it was discipline." "Did you ever hear her say anything about training or control?" Eduardo pressed. "Yes," Camila said, voice dropping. "She would say children need limits. She would say Sofia would be delicate and needed shaping. She would mark meals down, write things in a book. I thought it was a plan. I didn't—" Her sentence broke like a thread. Camila agreed to meet Mariana's investigators. She promised she would tell the truth. She was terrified. Her job and more, the household's loyalty, were on the line. She was not the only one who had noticed odd patterns. Donna Maria, the elderly cook who'd been escorted off payroll a year earlier during a restructuring, texted Eduardo in the quiet hours. "I always thought she was too strict." I showed him how to find the old messages. Patterns began to take shape like submerged stones. Someone had removed a plate. Someone had logged food intake in a leather-bound notebook kept inside a locked drawer. The staff's memories painted a picture that did not fit the polished narrative Patricia had displayed at charity galas. There were references to control and boundaries in the notebook. There were dates and check marks next to meals missed. But pattern did not equal proof. Records had to be corroborated, witnesses had to be willing to stand up, and the public tide had already turned in the other direction, shaped by an article that suggested Eduardo's neglect. The first real blow came in the guise of a letter. An anonymous envelope slid under Eduardo's home office door late at night. Inside, a single flash drive and an index card. Watch. His hands were unsteady when he inserted the drive into his laptop. The file names were timestamps, short clips from the house's cameras. The first clip was grainy, black and white, a little jagged with compression. It showed the kitchen at night. A small figure, no more than a silhouette, approached a high chair. A hand, firm and gloved in a faint way, picked up a plate and set it aside. The hand moved like a practiced motion, almost ritualistic. The clip ended when footsteps, those 3 measured, inevitable clicks, crossed into frame. He watched it twice, then a third time, as if the repetition could sharpen the image. He could feel the marble coldness again in the bones of his face. The footage answered questions without giving motives. It suggested intent. It suggested planning. If the drive was true, if the footage had been taken from his house, if the timestamp could be authenticated. He held up the small rabbit toy Sophia had clutched the day she was removed. He thought of the drawing on the counter, the plate drawn thick. He thought of the phrase the doctor had used, moderate to severe. He felt outrage grow like a storm cloud, the kind that begins as personal fury and expands until it demands public accountability. That night, the mansion seemed to breathe around him with the slow exhale of an empty lung. He paced the kitchen, turned the pages of a family album, and watched smiles with teeth like teeth on a saw. There were photographs of boardrooms and awards ceremonies and holidays where he clutched a small bundle of blanket and a submissive grin. In none of those photos was there the urgency he felt now. In none of those photos did he see Patricia closing a pantry door. He met Patricia at the dining room table. She arrived as if summoned, hands perfectly positioned, eyes cool. "I knew you'd come back," she said. Her voice was without tremor. "It's unfortunate, but these things happen when a child is placed in too many environments. It's confusing." "How could you do this?" Eduardo demanded, not loud, not theatrical, but edged and close. "You should have told me. You should have come to me." She smiled in the way of someone with rehearsed remorse. "You know my method," she said. "I was trying to set boundaries. You've been traveling. I didn't want to upset her." "You locked the pantry," he said. The sentence landed like a verdict. She looked at him as if he had misspoken. "I locked away sweets," she said, "for her own health. There's nothing illegal about that." "There's nothing illegal about malnutrition?" The accusation trembled. "The pediatrician said she's undernourished." Patricia's face did not fall. "A single test. We'll contest it. You're impulsive, Eduardo, reactionary. You start fires and then you wonder why they burn." He could hear the cameras in his head clicking on. He could see the editorials forming. He could feel his company's exposure to headlines that favored spectacle over nuance. He also felt something else, the sense that when a partner in life is capable of creating an image and living inside it, the person outside that image is either complicit or blind. He left the mansion while the night was still young. Patricia watched him go from the conservatory, hands folded, the moonlight painting her skin in high contrast. For the first time, in whatever private chambers of his heart had sheltered admiration, he felt a frost. The next morning, the smear campaign intensified. A local morning show ran a segment with a voiceover that stitched together clips of Eduardo arriving at airports, his company's logos, and a narrator who asked quietly, "How involved can the father of a young child be when the world demands so much?" The implication was sharp. Absence equals culpability.
Patricia's social media streams filled with messages from friends expressing sorrow, admiration for her strength, and thinly veiled questions about Eduardo's priorities. Anonymous blogs resurfaced archived comments about his temperament. Someone with access to the family's calendar leaked a series of late-night business dinners.
The press did what it does best. It turned a private crisis into a public puzzle and assembled the pieces to make villains out of the convenient person. His phone began to ring in patterns, frantic, strategic numbers, reporters pretending to be neighbors. His assistant left increasingly curt voicemail messages. "Can you authorize a press statement? Investors are asking for transparency." He played the calls on a loop without answering. Every ring felt like an indictment. At the law firm, Mariana was precise. She filed for emergency visitation rights, requested expedited records from the hospital, and began the slow accumulation of paperwork that in public eyes reads as legitimacy. "We need to show ongoing involvement," she said. "Flights, messages, holiday calendar, photos where you are present, anything that demonstrates you have been parenting. And we need third-party testimony, nannies, former staff, the cook. You said Dona Maria had concerns? She'll be important." "That's the thing," Eduardo said. "So many of them are afraid. They fear losing livelihoods. They fear retaliation." "Then we give them protection," Mariana said. "We make statements in court. We get subpoenas if necessary. We build a paper trail." Building a case is a geography of patience. It takes time. But time was the one commodity Eduardo might not have. Sofia was in a shelter defined by fluorescent lights and mandated routines. The shelter's counselors were careful and kind in the way of people whose jobs teach them to listen without promising outcomes. They told him about food aversions, about how children who experience deprivation can develop a lasting anxiety around meals. They taught him to sit with questions he could not answer. He went to see his daughter whenever he could. They permitted supervised visits, and each time was a study in small recoveries. Sofia learned to take a cup from his hand without flinching. He read stories to her in a small visitation room where toys lined a shelf and a TV looped cartoons. She asked simple things, an innocent catalog of wants that made him both laugh and cry. "Will we plant sunflowers? Can we get a little cat?" He promised both, because promises were all he could give that seemed like a bridge from the sterile rooms to a different life. Meanwhile, Patricia continued to perform competence in public. She spoke at a wellness luncheon about setting boundaries for kids. She sat for interviews where she discussed children's diets with professionals whose names were footnoted in press releases. She appeared untroubled at social functions, photographed in gowns with other luminaries. The juxtaposition of her public persona with the private accusations might have been unbearable in a different life, but she navigated both with the kind of confidence that comes from rehearsed denial. Rumors began to slide into pressure. Someone, Patricia's consultant perhaps, had made sure that social services file included a notation from an anonymous source suggesting Eduardo's erratic behavior made the home unpredictable. The source's name was traced to an email account that led nowhere. The scribbles in the staff's notebooks had been dismissed as anecdotal by a well-meaning column. But not everyone was silent. Camila showed up at Mariana's office, clutching a small leather-bound notebook. "I kept this," she said simply. "I thought I shouldn't, but I am sorry." Inside were dates, meal descriptions, quantities, shorthand for "no dinner" or "plate taken." There were also entries that made it clear someone had schemed to control what Sofia ate, notes that read like a plan rather than ad hoc parenting. Mariana photocopied every page with surgical calm. "We'll need to authenticate this," she said. "Sworn affidavits. Camila, can you come into court if necessary?" Camila nodded, the gesture of someone who had already woken in the night and rehearsed courage. The drive with the footage sat in Eduardo's desk like a small combustible object. He had not shown it to the hospital. He had not shown it to the social worker. He was afraid of accusations, of doctored evidence,
of the allegation that he was manipulating proof to win his child back. But he also understood that evidence could move the narrative in a way that apologies could not. He began with the easiest thing. He collected messages. Flight manifests proved he had been home more than the articles suggested. His phone showed a series of late-night calls where he had read to a sleeping child. He compiled photographs, stolen fragments of normalcy, pancake mornings, sunburned noses on a beach, a small hand gripping a grown-up finger on a museum visit. None of these erased the harm, but they complicated the public picture. The first investigator he hired was not one who specialized in corporate espionage or boardroom warfare. He hired someone who knew households secreted their truths. Anna was a private investigator with a soft voice and a reputation for locating things people preferred hidden. She had worked cases where truth lived in receipts, in forgotten calendar entries, in the grain of home surveillance footage. Anna walked the mansion with Eduardo as if mapping a crime scene. She noted the locks on pantries and on cabinets, the little changes that people make when they begin to normalize control. In the nursery, she found folded receipts from a boutique dietitian, prescriptions for supplements that did not match a pediatric diagnosis, and a bank statement with payments to a social media manager. Anna's eyes lingered on a typed itinerary on the fridge with the words "Sophia schedule, meals" highlighted. This was never an incidental thing, she said. By now, the house smelled of something less than lemon. It smelled of secrets. It smelled of the pause before the press arrives. Eduardo began to sleep in short jolts. His meals shrank to coffee and the breathless hours before meetings. He answered to legal briefs and to messages where his daughter's name was mentioned like a scald. But beneath the legal strategy and the press calls was a simpler, louder thing. He had to get her back. One morning, when the winter was still thin and the sunlight came in gray sheets, a short video went viral. It was shot by an anonymous neighbor, Patricia waving at a camera outside the mansion, smiling, while Sophia skipped beside her, holding her hand. The clip was used everywhere as evidence that all was well inside the household. The commentators framed the removal as an overreach. Eduardo felt the air leave him again. He watched the clip until his eyes blurred. How can one woman manage a public image and a private life so precisely? His friend asked, stunned. It's like she's made a suit of herself that never wrinkles. Eduardo did not answer. He signed affidavits. He went to court for the emergency hearing with Mariana by his side. The room smelled of coffee and jurisprudence. Lawyers wore expressions practiced into masks. The judge, Dr. Fernando Almeida, an experienced jurist with a reputation for not being impressed by money, listened. Patricia's lawyer argued that the pediatric visit had been singular, that Sophia was in a household where boundaries mattered, that Eduardo, despite his presence in photos, had been absent in practice. The state cited the medical report and ordered supervision. The judge did not make a ruling that day beyond scheduling a full hearing. Sophia remained in protective care until the court had time to consider the reports. The legal limbo tasted like nothing so much as suspended breath. Back at the mansion, in the study where he had once signed million-dollar deals, Eduardo sat with the grainy footage again. He paused it, zoomed, sharpened. He wanted to find a face. He wanted to find a motive. The image was small, a dark hand moving like a metronome. He replayed the clip until the night outside his windows was not night, but a theater of accusation. On his phone, a message popped up from an unknown number. "I saw the notebooks. I will tell you more. Meet me tonight." The message left no signature. He stared at the screen. Trust in his life had always been transactional. He made offers and sealed agreements. This was different. Trust now had to be coaxed from fear, from loyalties, from people with mouths full of tea and jobs. He had to find someone who would be brave enough to stand in court and say openly that the perfectly curated life he had married into had been a stage for cruelty. He drove to the coffee shop the message had suggested. The rain had started in thin threads, making the city look like a watercolor. Inside the cafe, a woman in a gray coat sat at the corner table, cup cradled. Donna Maria, hair in a bun, face lined like a map. She had left before, years ago, because of a restructuring that reduced staff and increased distance. She told him what she had seen, a pattern of corrections, a ledger kept about food, nights when Sofia was not given dinner as punishment for impatience. She mentioned a man named Alessandro, an ex-husband of Patricia, who had once whispered warnings to friends at parties and had since stepped back from public life. "He told me once," Donna Maria said quietly, "that she always needed to be admired, that she would rather be feared than loved." Her words were small, but they fit into the growing pattern. Eduardo felt, as if for the first time, the possibility of assembling a case not only built on medical facts, but on motive. He left the cafe with more questions than answers. In his pocket he carried another list, names, approximate dates, small notations in a hand that trembled only slightly. He would need to find Alessandro. He would need to find Camilla and compel her to speak. He would need the footage authenticated. He would need to protect witnesses who might risk everything. That night, in the dark of his study, an alert lit his phone. A new video had been uploaded, this one longer, higher resolution. Someone had taken a copy from a nanny's backup camera and sent it anonymously to Mariana. The file began with the sound of a kettle boiling and ended with the hush of the early morning. It captured a sequence of moments, a meal plate taken away, a whisper of protest, the slow sliding of a dining chair, the faint signature of heel clicks that matched the rhythm he had learned was hers. The clip ended before anyone could see a face whole, but the camera had caught a ledger left open on the counter. There, in a shot that trembled with domestic familiarity, the leather-bound notebook lay open, dates circled, quantities crossed out, the word teach underlined. Eduardo sat in the dark and let a single torrential thing occur. He vowed to learn how to be the kind of father who could not be undermined by someone who cultivated fear as an art. He vowed to rebuild the trust he had helped fray with absence. He vowed to find the truth and bring it into the light. Outside, the house breathed its hard, controlled breath. Inside, he collected evidence, sent encrypting messages, and prepared to ask the court for what money and reputation could not buy: his daughter's safe return. The path would not be swift, it would not be clean, but for the first time since the whisper on the marble, he felt the direction of his life tilt toward a single, immutable line. As midnight thinned into early morning, a knock came to his door. He opened it to a man in a plain jacket, eyes tired and direct. He handed Eduardo a bundle of papers, employment records, timestamps, receipts. The man didn't speak much. "You'll need this," he said, "and that drive. Get it to Mariana. Authenticate everything. They'll try to paint you as the villain." He paused. "Be prepared for the media to get uglier before it gets better." Eduardo took the papers. In a world where he had always measured risk with spreadsheets and projections, the variables had become human. He placed the bundle on his desk and looked at the drawings Sofia had made, the sun, the small plate, the tiny figure beside it. He imagined the two of them planting sunflowers in the spring, sunlight on their faces, the smell of soil instead of antiseptic. He imagined mornings where a small voice would not have to whisper to be heard. He slid the flash drive into his pocket and closed the drawers slowly. The house around him was silent, as if listening. The next steps were uncertain, but in that uncertainty something solid formed, a plan. He would fight the narrative, he would gather witnesses, he would demand justice, not vengeance. There would be hearings and filings and public spectacle, and a courtroom where strangers in robes would parse the most intimate episodes of his domestic life.
But first, he would get her home. He would bring her back from the fluorescent rooms and the orderly protocols to a place where sunflowers could grow. He walked toward the stairwell, feeling the marble under his shoes like a cold truth. He paused halfway up and looked back down to where Sophia had sat just days before. The space seemed both enormous and small. He could see how a child could disappear into its scale. He placed his hand on the banister and found that his palm fit the same grooves his ancestors had worn into trees, a familiar reassurance. He had the footage. He had witnesses willing to risk discomfort. He had a lawyer who moved with the precision of someone who had navigated courts before. The press would howl. Patricia would not yield her image without maneuvering. And in the middle of it all was a child who needed more than testimonies. She needed care and the slow rebuilding of trust. He turned away from the stairwell into his study and began to type. Emails to Mariana, messages to Anna, a list of the people he needed to protect, a list of the things he would say if asked to speak publicly. The night hummed with the electricity of work. He worked until the sky at the edge of the blinds blushed with dawn, and then he went to the shelter to sit with his daughter as she woke to another day governed by strangers doing their best to fix something that had been broken for a long time. He had a court date, a press conference request, and a battalion of people in motion around him. But his life had simplified to one unyielding imperative: bring her home and keep her there. The days that followed became a slow, exacting calculus of proof. Eduardo moved through them with the single-mindedness of someone who had learned to measure success by results. Only now the result he craved was a safe return of a small, frightened girl. He did not expect anything to be easy. He did not expect the public to behave kindly. He expected, instead, the raw arithmetic of witnesses, timestamps, authenticated files. Comment where you're watching from.
Mariana began by putting pressure where the system could respond. Legal motions, subpoenas for the hospital records, formal requests to the agency that had placed Sophia in protective care. Anna, the investigator, worked in parallel. Quiet calls to former staff, careful interviews conducted off the record, a chain of custody that left no room for accusations of tampering. They moved as if they were assembling a fragile mosaic, one brittle tile at a time, each piece necessary to reveal the larger picture. Security footage was the first piece that could be tested. Anna had the drives authenticated by a digital forensics lab that worked with law enforcement on sensitive household cases. The lab's report confirmed that the timestamps aligned with the server logs and the camera system's metadata. The clips were not cinematic, they were ordinary, grainy grayscale, interrupted by the dim blur of a hallway light. But their ordinariness made them more damning. The cameras captured a pattern: plates removed at night, a small figure approaching the pantry only to find it latched, a sequence of measured footsteps crossing a room. Camila and Donna Maria provided the second layer. Under Mariana's careful guidance, they gave sworn statements detailing the notations in the letter-bound book and the small systematic choices they had earlier explained in whispers. Meals written down, snacks withheld, dates next to the phrase "teach restraint." Their words were steady but not rehearsed. In court, underscored by their signatures and notarized affidavits, those entries shifted from rumor to record. Alessandro proved to be the most complicated witness of all. He had been distant, and for good reasons: old shame and the political cost of speaking about a woman who had since rebuilt a public persona. But when he met Eduardo in a neutral room, his face carried the exhaustion of someone relieved to unburden himself. He told of conversations at dinner tables long before the adoption, of offhand comments that, in light of the other evidence, read like an admission of temperament. a preference for admiration over warmth, a habit of performance and control. His testimony would not, on its own, prove the case. It gave motive and reinforced the pattern. The breakthrough came when Anna traced a bank transfer and a hurried booking attempt. Patricia, under pressure, had begun to move assets and send messages that suggested a plan to leave the country if the scrutiny intensified. The investigators intercepted a withdrawal attempt tied to a private flight booking and a transfer of household funds to an offshore account. The transfer itself was not a crime in most jurisdictions. The intent and secrecy around it were what mattered. In a court of law, intent is often the needle that lawyering threads through facts. Anna presented the records and a screenshot of a hurried chat in which Patricia suggested reorganizing the logistics in case things escalated.
When Mariana served the discovery to Patricia's counsel, the reaction was notable for what was not said. Instead, the stepmother's team argued about privacy and motive, attempting to paint Eduardo's evidence-gathering as a show of wealth using power to manufacture guilt. The strategy was predictable: counterattack the credibility of witnesses, claim bias, question the chain of custody. Media columns dutifully wrote about both sides, turning nuance into an even field of he said, she said. Behind the headlines, the medical evidence remained firm. Dr. Renato's reports had been comprehensive, weight charts showing a downward trend, blood work indicating anemia consistent with chronic undernourishment, and notes from a dietitian recommending a slow reintroduction of calories to avoid refeeding syndrome. Those reports had been filed with Child Protective Services and were part of the official record. In the months after Sophia's removal, pediatric specialists testified about the clinical signs of prolonged caloric restriction in children her age and the psychological fallout, how fear around food could linger after physical needs were met. As the calendar slipped toward the scheduled hearing, Eduardo adjusted to a rhythm he once thought foreign: depositions, witness preparation, shuttle rides between the firm, the shelter, and the courthouse. He sat with therapists who briefed him on how to talk to Sophia about food without triggering panic, and he learned to sit in small rooms with small toys and not try to fix everything in a single visit. Each supervised hour with his daughter was a class in humility: how to speak in small sentences, how to follow her lead, how to let a child set the pace of reconciliation. When the hearing day arrived, the courthouse held the measured calm of civic ritual. The public gallery contained a scatter of faces, some local journalists, an editor, the occasional neighbor. Patricia arrived in a carefully made outfit. The press noticed, and the photos of her composed composure circulated immediately. Her lawyer opened with a strategy designed to destabilize: emphasize Eduardo's frequent travel, suggest that the hospital's initial findings were part of an overreach, imply that staff notes were colored by conflicts and retrospection. Mariana's opening argument was different in tone, measured, precise, without flourish. She laid out the evidence like a map: medical reports, authenticated footage, sworn affidavits, the leather-bound notebook itself, and the financial records that suggested an attempted departure. She did not speak in barbed phrases meant for camera bites. She presented timestamps, exhibit numbers, and witness lists. A courtroom responds to clarity. The judge, Dr. Fernando Almeida, took notes with a slow attention that felt at once old-fashioned and necessary. The first witness was Dr. Renato. He testified to the physical signs he had observed and explained plainly what they meant. He described how small children adapt to scarcity, how they ration requests and learn to hide hunger, and how these patterns manifest in behavior. His testimony was clinical and compassionate in equal measure, and it established a standard against which the rest of the evidence could be gauged. Next came Camilla,
On the stand she did not perform. She answered in the tone of someone who had no interest in rhetorical flourish. She described dates and small incidents, plates taken away, lunches that went uneaten because they were removed, nights when Sophia ate in the nursery and was told she had already had enough. Mariana led her through her notebook entries with soft precision, and the court listened as a microcosm of household routine unfolded. Lists, check marks, a regimen that read more like a program than the messy improvisation of daily parenting. Donna Maria's testimony followed. She carried in her voice the wear of someone who had once believed in rules and later learned they had been a tool for intimidation. She spoke of occasions where Patricia insisted on corrections in front of staff, of comments about shaping character, and reimbursements for a nutritionist whose consultations were strangely tailored. Her presence on the stand, calm and resolute, made the diary entries and the footage cohere into a human narrative that extended beyond the pixels of a video file. The footage played mid-trial. The courtroom went quiet as the screen showed small domestic acts, a hand moving a plate, a toddler approaching otherwise empty counters, a ledger on the counter just visible in the frame. The playback revealed in a single mundane sequence the choreography of control. Patricia's attorney asked for context, what the clips omitted, why nothing villainous was explicitly shown, but the pattern was plain. The judge watched, face unreadable, as the room held its breath. Patricia testified in her own defense. She spoke with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being observed. She framed her actions as one parent's attempt to instill health and discipline, insisting that any measures she took were administered with the child's long-term benefit in mind. When asked about the notebook and the check marks next to meals, she characterized them as a plan created with a dietitian, a regimen meant to reduce sugar and establish routines. It was a plausible story in a vacuum. Mariana's cross-examination cut through the plausible as the trial's momentum shifted. She produced receipts for consultations that did not match the pediatric timeline, and emails where Patricia had used language that left little room for ambiguity, phrases like "teach her to be less demanding," and notes about reduction strategies that read more like control than healthcare. When confronted with the intercepted transfer and the text messages about logistics, Patricia's explanation frayed. The defense offered alternative motives and insisted on speculation, but the court had, by then, the methodical accumulation of evidence. A small, decisive moment came when Alessandro took the stand. He did not need to paint a picture of cruelty. He supplied texture. He described how Patricia had once expressed a fascination with being admired, how she had redirected anger toward the household, and how she had ranked image over intimacy. The cross-examination was fierce, but his testimony did not hinge on animus alone. It corroborated behavior patterns that matched the notebooks and the footage. Throughout the proceedings, the press churned commentary into opinion pieces. Patricia's supporters, citing her philanthropic work, demanded nuance. Eduardo's critics questioned the timing of the revelations. But inside the courtroom, such chatter mattered little. The law's work is to distill facts from noise, and the facts continued to accumulate in one direction. When the judge rendered his decision, the room had been through hours of testimony and pages of exhibits. He did not reach for melodrama. He read, in a voice that aimed to be careful rather than theatrical, a ruling that reflected the burdens of proof and the obligations of the state to protect a child. The judge found that the preponderance of evidence supported a finding of neglect consistent with a pattern of caloric deprivation and psychological control. He ordered that temporary custody be granted to Eduardo, with the caveat that reunification be gradual and supported by court-ordered therapy and supervised visitation initially. He issued a protective order barring Patricia from unsupervised contact and referred the matter to prosecutors for potential criminal investigation. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and varied. Eduardo's shoulders loosened in a way they had not in months. The release was physical as much as emotional. Patricia stared without overt display, her face a study in contained ruin. Journalists clustered with their notepads alight. But for Eduardo, the moment was not triumph. It was a beginning of repair, regulated and cautious. He stepped out into a corridor where the air felt like air after a storm, and he called for a supervised visit as soon as the paperwork allowed. Sophia's return home was not a return to a perfect past. The child who had learned to ration hope needed slow, repetitive care. The pediatric team insisted on incremental meals, a plan labored over like a blueprint, small servings every 2 hours, observation for anxieties, play-based interventions to rebuild safe associations with food. A child psychologist named Dr. Elena worked with them on what she described as retraining the body's trust. Therapists used games and drawing exercises to let Sophia express what words could not hold.
She drew plates again, this time coloring them bright and whole. She started to sleep longer without waking for imagined scarcities. Eduardo learned to do things he had once delegated. He found himself stirring batter in mismatched bowls, watching as pancakes browned in a pan he had never used. The first batch burned slightly, an honest domestic mistake, but the kitchen's warmth felt like a new kind of currency. He took pleasure in small repetitions, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the way a little hand reached for syrup in a way that said, softly, "I belong here." The father learned the language of restoration. He practiced sitting, listening, and staying. He learned to pause before saying words that could be read as scolding, to model calm in the face of tantrums that were, more often than not, the echo of prior fear. He met with counselors who taught him how to rebuild attachment, predictable routines, clear boundaries delivered with tenderness, and rituals that could anchor a child in the safety of a household. He honored those rituals: breakfast together on Sundays, a bedtime routine with the same 2 stories, a small tea on rainy afternoons. There were legal aftershocks. Patricia, stripped of custody and under criminal review, fought back through attorneys, filing motions and alleging procedural errors. The prosecutors moved slowly. Criminal proceedings are deliberate, and not every referral becomes a conviction. The public continued to weigh in, but the immediate practicalities, ensuring Sophia's well-being and protecting her from future manipulation, were moving ahead with court oversight. Months later, the light in the house shifted. The marble still gleamed, but it no longer read as a monument to cold control. The conservatory was still immaculate, but a cluster of more ordinary objects, small gardening tools, a sun hat with a slightly frayed brim, appeared in the entry. Their presence was proof that a life was being remade by people who would show up in the small ways daily required. Sophia began to bloom in the patient, stubborn rhythm children find when given space to recover. She let Eduardo braid her hair in the mornings. She asked questions, sudden and precise, about flowers and where seeds come from. One afternoon in early spring, they planted a small bed for sunflowers in a corner of the property that had been seeded from formal landscaping to a spot of loose soil. Her hands were tiny in the dirt, and when she pressed the seeds into the earth, she did it with a seriousness that made Eduardo laugh and cry at once. Therapy sessions continued. The psychologist spoke about resiliency and time, about how recovery is not linear, and how relapses in fear could appear even after months of steady improvement. Eduardo accepted that parenting would be work, long-term, patient, and often mundane. He took unpaid leaves and cut back his travel. Business affairs were delegated. The company survived. He began to measure success differently. not in quarterly profits, but in the strength of a child's laughter on a particular morning. A small ginger cat appeared one weekday, a friend from a shelter Eduardo had quietly contacted. Sophia named it Miga and took to brushing its fur with steady strokes. The cat, it turned out, belonged to the category of therapeutic animals, unbothered, warm, offering quiet companionship that did not ask for explanations. The sight of Sophia, ankle-deep in soil, with Miga asleep at her feet, became the family's quiet emblem of healing. The community that had once watched in gossip now followed a slower arc of sympathy. Some neighbors offered helpful meals and volunteered to water the sunflower bed. The staff that had been brave enough to testify, Camila and Dona Maria, were given legal protections and, when appropriate, financial restitution for the risk they took. Mariana worked to ensure their safety as they navigated the social fallout of being involved in a high-profile case. Patricia's legal maneuvers continued in separate civil and criminal paths, but the core of the family life had been guarded. The court's protective measures and the court-ordered therapy gave Eduardo a scaffold onto which he could rebuild a home where the word hungry would never again be a secret. He did not pretend the damage had vanished. He did not promise instant wholeness. He simply showed up in the ways children understand, consistently, predictably, tenderly. There were small, emblematic scenes that marked the slow change. One evening, Sophia climbed onto the couch with a book and asked to read aloud. Her voice was thin at first, then found strength in a rhythm. Eduardo listened, not offering advice, just clapping softly at the end. Another day, she left a drawing on the kitchen counter, a large sunflower, a round, full plate, and two small stick figures holding hands. The plate was colored fully. There was no rattle of absence in the picture. Eduardo slid the drawing into a frame and placed it where he could see it when he passed through the kitchen. In private, he still sometimes caught himself counting the minutes until he could check on her, measuring his calendar around nap times and therapy sessions. The old reflex, work, travel, distance, did not vanish overnight, but his priorities had been reordered around a small, concrete heart. Company memos were signed and sent, but in evenings he learned to be present in ways he had not before, reading the same story night after night until the words grew familiar and beloved to a child. The legal closure, when it came, was not a single thunderclap. The criminal referral led to charges being filed on counts related to child neglect. The civil battles over custody, visitation, and damages continued in quieter channels.
But the central, urgent crisis had been resolved. The child was home, sheltered by the law and surrounding care, and the person who had orchestrated control had been removed from the immediate orbit. In a small, ordinary ceremony, absent from the cameras, Eduardo and Sophia sat on the back steps of the house and watched the first sunflowers push toward the sky. Sophia leaned into his side, hair smelling faintly of dirt and sun. She had learned to count, and she counted the petals aloud, slow and precise. He listened to her small voice and felt a quiet so strong it almost had a sound. The mansion remained, in one sense, the same structure of marble and finish, but its meaning had shifted. Where Patricia had once used its rooms as a stage, Eduardo had begun to repurpose them as a setting for intimacy. The dining table saw pancakes and homework, not curated hospitality. The nursery was messy in a way that made sense, colors on the floor, a tiny backpack abandoned on a chair. Months after the hearing, in a private conversation with the therapist present, they signed a mediated agreement that spelled out parental responsibilities and ongoing oversight. It would not be a forever guarantee, no court can promise that, but it was a framework designed to prioritize Sophia's stability. The judge, pragmatic and firm, reminded them both that the child's welfare would always be the guiding principle. On a late summer morning, when the light in the garden gathered like a warm cup, Eduardo made breakfast for Sofia. She climbed onto a chair and watched as he flipped pancakes, this time without burning them. He poured syrup in a small, crooked, smile-shaped stream. She dipped her finger and tasted, and when she smiled, it was an uncomplicated thing. He thought of all the contracts he'd ever signed, all the deals that had defined him, and he felt none compared to that soft, unmeasured exchange of trust across a kitchen table. He never stopped attending to the work of repair, to therapy sessions, to school meetings, to the quiet negotiations of a child learning to trust grown-ups. He also found in the work a new kind of satisfaction, one that did not require applause but did ask for constancy. The empire he had built remained. He stewarded it differently now, with fewer flights and more presence. The story did not end with the judge's gavel. Healing after a crisis is a practice without a finish line. But the shape of their life had changed, from sterile and performance-driven to slow and domestic. The sunflowers in the yard grew tall, bright faces turning each morning toward the sun. Sofia watched them with the steady attention of someone who had learned what it meant to wait for light to arrive. On a quiet afternoon, as they planted another row of seeds, she looked up at Eduardo and asked, without any pressure, "Will you stay?"
He placed a hand over hers, small fingers wrapped around dirt and hope, and said, with a certainty that came from the depth of the months behind them, "I'm here. I'm staying." If this story moved you, subscribe for more real-life drama and investigative retellings.